Welcome to In the Telling. I'm Stephen G. Forwood.
And I'm Miranda Mims, and we are the co-founders of the Nomadic Archivist Project. The Nomadic Archivist Project stands in solidarity with the actions being taken to address racial discrimination against Black people in the United States. Our deepest condolences to the families of the women, men, and children who have been killed by the police and racist individuals.
We mourn the passing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others who have lost their lives over the past 400 years in this country to racial terrorism. We support demonstrations across the U.S. and the world by those who strive to end racist, misanthropic violence. NAP will continue to do our work to archive Black stories because we need to save and tell our stories.
I would like to welcome our guest today, Darnell Pritchard, an award-winning writer, cultural critic, and associate professor of English at the University of Buffalo. He is also faculty at Loaf School of English at Middlebury College. Eric is the author of Fashioning Lives, Black Queers in Politics and Literacy, and editor of Sartorial Politics, Intersectionality, and Queer Worldmaking, a special issue of QED, a journal in GLBTQ Worldmaking. Pritchard's writing on fashion, popular culture, literacy, rhetoric, and pedagogies have been published in multiple venues, including the International Journal of Fashion Studies, Harvard Educational Review, Visual Anthropology, Literacy and Composition Studies, and ARTFORUM. Currently, he's completing 2 books, a historical ethnography of Black queer feminist literacy activism, and a biography of 1980s international fashion superstar Patrick Kelly. Welcome to In the Telling, Eric. We are very happy to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on. I was just thinking about when you were at Schaumburg in 2009 as a scholar in residence. Did we meet before that?
I think we did when I was in graduate school, because by that time I wasn't. So we had met a couple of times when I would come to the Schaumburg as just a dissertator. And I'm from New York City. So, it was always, the Schaumburg to me is always the library I take with me everywhere I go. So,
well, good. Yeah. So in our conversation online, we spoke about you said you wanted to talk about these 2 fires, basically, and in some ways how they shape the work that you're doing right now. And I'm curious, I want you to introduce us to your family, your parents and siblings, and where you grew up, and then let's talk a little bit about those fires.
Yeah, so the way I always describe my family is I would say I grew up in the household of Black feminist abundance, right? So I was raised by my grandmother, my mother, and her sisters.
Okay.
And they raised me, my 2 brothers, and my 3 cousins, female cousins, Jasmine, Jonte, and Jalise, my brother Xavier. And we lived in basically 3 different sections of Queens my entire life.
Okay.
And as far as I've been able to trace my family's lineage, to my great-great-grandparents, they've always lived in Queens as far as back as I've gone. So we've lived, as I was growing up in Corona, New York, and then moved to South Jamaica, Queens, and went in between there and Flushing, pretty much my entire childhood. And I think of my family as like, we were like the Black Brady Bunch, right? My mother and them had that same experience. 3 male children, 3 female children. My mother was the same way, her and her 2 sisters and her 2 cousins, working class family, working poor family, poor family. It just depended upon and the circumstances.
Okay.
As Stephen was talking about earlier, so there was a fire that happened. Was this in one of the houses in Queens?
Yeah, the 2 fires. So the first fire happened before I was born. My cousin JJ, who is the oldest person in this, of my cousin, was a baby at the time. And there's a street that was near the Wonder Bread Company in Queens called 40th Road. And it's near a public housing project that was called The Bland, or it is called The Bland. And my family had lived there. The maternal side of my family had lived there like forever. And they tell the story about having a fire that was caused by the Christmas tree catching fire. And they
Christmas tree that was in your house?
was in my family's house. Yeah.
Was this a row house or was this a detached house?
It's a detached house, but like on houses that are very close together on basically a dead end street.
On this side?
Yeah, essentially, yes, exactly. So right across the street from all the houses was a Con Edison kind of plant. So it's just a fence with a bunch of Con Edison wires and trucks and things like that. And then at the end of that block were train tracks, and on the other side of the train tracks was the Wonder Bread, which was wonderful because you could always smell the bread. Even when I was a kid and we would go back, I could smell the bread baking.
Oh, nice.
It was incredible. And so the house caught on fire because of this, the Christmas tree. It was a live Christmas tree, and it just got too hot. And the fire, from what my mom and them would tell me, just like, it was like, there was no fire. And then, and then it was just a fire. And I think that like really led to a lot of, anxieties in my family about, Christmas trees. So we always had artificial when I was growing up. And I think that's where that came from. They then had another fire after I was born. At this point, I was about 3 years old. So this is in the early 80s. Still living in Flushing, but on another street that's maybe about a 15-minute walk away, 10 minutes. And in that fire, the way my mom tells the story is they like had to throw me out the window. Like I was a baby.
Wow.
We lived on the second floor. And it was just too risky for them to try to get themselves and get, me and my brothers like out the front door. So they just was like, okay, somebody go outside and we're just going to we'll throw Eric out. And so, my family just always they would tell the story all the time. I would hear the story at least 2 or 3 times a year. We're around Christmas because of the Christmas tree incident, the first one.
The first one was what year again?
My cousin JJ was a baby, so this would have been 1971.
Okay.
And then I was about 3 when the second, so this would have been like 81, 82.
Okay. So not very far from each other.
Yeah, no.
What's the decade?
That trauma, I can imagine why people were constantly working.
Yeah. So I feel like it really just affected a lot of ways in which my family, just different practices, I think, built themselves around the trauma, to your point of like experiencing those fires. I think for some ways for better and some for worse.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about what happened to the family archive in terms of both the first and the second fire, if you have any sense of what happened to the photograph, things that would sort of like kind of tell the stories about your family.
Yeah. So from the first fire, they were able to save some pictures, but everything was destroyed. They lost everything in that first. The second one wasn't as bad, but they took all the pictures out, right? So I think part of what, like in my family, photographs are everything. If you have another fire, we always told this, if we ever have a fire, save each other and save the pictures.
Yeah.
Right? Everything else can be replaced. Yeah. And I think it came from like them losing so many photographs in that person. Yeah. That photographs in my family have become a kind of, it's like serious,
Right.
Like, the person who had the family photos, it's like the elders choose you, and it's usually the person who's like compassionate in some way. Like we don't want the selfish person in the film. The picture they won't share, right?
Yeah.
And also the person who's responsible, So and I think it all comes from that fire. I think that they really just put a lot of precedent on how do we keep this thing that is so valuable to them, their memories, and really I think for my family, not just the photos, but the photos are like the way they would tell a story about their life. Right, every picture I would learn about people who I didn't even know from them, like taking these photo albums out every year and telling us stuff about people. There was never any mention about other kinds of documents, deeds or, letters or anything of that sort. The emphasis was always on pictures when I was growing up. And I find that to be really interesting.
For the first fire, how long was your family in that house?
Oh, they had lived, that house was like the house my mom had grown up.
Okay, so they had a lot of things that were in that house.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, my entire family lived on that street. Aunts and uncles in the next house, another set of aunts and uncles on the other. Like the whole, cul-de-sac was people who were like actual blood relatives, or as I'm sure y'all are familiar, people who are our relatives, even though
Relatives, yes.
yes, exactly. And right now, like on that street, there's only one person who lived there when my mom was growing up who remains. He's like the holdout. He refuses to sell his
Wow.
Conrad. But like everything else is different now. It's all commercial properties and things.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been there for at least since my mom was in middle school. I want to say maybe even elementary school.
So they have a long history in that house. With the pictures that you have now, do you have any pictures of that house or of your family celebrating or being in that house or around the house in the yard?
Yeah, I have pictures of them sitting on the stoop outside
Good.
the house.
Okay.
I have pictures of them outside, like playing when they were kids, or my cousins who were a little bit old, well, a lot older than me when they were out there. I have photographs of them maybe not outside the house, but like parked outside of cars, posing in front of cars.
Right.
But you're not seeing the house, but just seeing them from the vantage point and standing in front of the house. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, always in that background is those train tracks or that Con Edison. And so, it's that street, 40th Road. Like it's always just occupied such a, it's a lot of myth around it, I think, and love and, sadness too.
Right.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And so how did these experiences and how did this sort of ritual of bringing out like photo albums and thinking about family, your family's history through pictures, how did this influence or interest your work in visual culture?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is this relationship between the photos and stories, and getting to know people. Like most of what I have written about, whether I'm talking about my literacy work and or in now writing a biography, it's often like, trying to put stories back together again for where there often aren't, I guess what I think of it as a researcher, the ideal document, right? And so like what that means is that like my mom, for example, she had a friend who passed away from AIDS complications, her best friend actually. And a lot of my mother's friends were Black gay men. And so I learned a lot about Black culture from my mom, telling me these stories about her friends who had all passed away.
Wow.
I never didn't know anything about them, right?
That's incredible.
Yeah. And so I think that like how that like has affected my work is that like I think I grew up valuing the ability of a photograph and the objects in a photograph to tell us much more than I think people believe that it can. So now as a researcher, while I would love, for example, in writing a biography, to be writing a biography about someone who documented and cataloged every day of his life, as many people have written such biographies, right? Not that it's any easier, but like I would have loved to have had that. I don't have that. What I have is someone who has a very expansive visual archive of himself, of his material work, of the dresses he made and who wore them. And, I have to be able to discern something and remember him as, a person from what's available. So in some ways I feel like, that being all my family had, kind of in some ways prepared me methodologically, right, to, do the work that I do now. I also think that when I look at the pictures of my family, they are, as I said, they were working poor, folks who were on welfare at some points. At other times, my mom worked at the post office. And, I write about fashion and beauty and culture. And so I look at them and it's just like, it was so beautiful, and they had very little, very little means. And they made beauty, they made happiness, they made culture, they made joy. And so I think of someone like Jamal Shabazz, the photographer.
Yes.
Yeah. Like when I look at his pictures, I'm always looking for my uncles and my aunts. And I don't literally find them or haven't yet, but I feel like I still find them, right? There's something about that everyday archive, like style and culture. And so, I think that, that has also affected me in my own work. Like the really obsessed with, the commonplaceness of, what these images are capturing. That it could tell us something really extraordinary.
I'm glad that you're bringing up these photographs of not ordinary objects, right? That they're special, and that even though you didn't see your relatives in the Jamal Shabazz stuff, you're still seeing them because of the time that they lived in, the kind of ways that they might have dressed, the context. And it feels very familial. His photographs seem really familial, and I love that about photographers like him, because I feel like they're photographing and they're capturing our family stories in the different kind of way, that they're here, the context. You answered my next question already about shaping the kind of scholarship that you do as it relates to these photographs, or the kind of so I want to go to another question. I'm going to steal it from Miranda and ask you, and I think it's the last one. This is one I'm sort of excited about, which is to talk about beauty, because doing work on Patrick Kelly and doing these works on these designers and this visual presence, I was curious about how you see beauty in your scholarship and what it reveals about the Black experience.
Yeah.
What might reveal?
For me, beauty is authenticity. And I think that, what I mean by that is when I'm looking at, whether it's Patrick Kelly's work, I'm looking at pictures, like people in my family going out to some dance at the VFW, right? They weren't necessarily, it's interesting. Like they both were kind of like, showing off, right? Like in some, but then at the same time, just having the experience and then documenting that for themselves wasn't enough. It wasn't for Jack. It wasn't for Essence. It wasn't for Ebony or anything like that, right? But we're at a point now, right? Like from a research standpoint, where it may be, right? It may achieve or could achieve that same level of significance, of what they understood to be significant. And so, I think that, whenever you are just like, being fully who, you are, without apology, and trying your best to express that and represent that, however complex it can be, I think that is beautiful. And I also think of beauty in relationship to abundance, right? For me, it's not a thing that ever runs out. It is, an infinite, amount of things, and it insists upon itself. So that's my sense of beauty.
And do you feel like these are some of the things that you're bringing up right now, around beauty, that this is something that you can trace back to the women in your family who were so foundational to your youth and growing up in a house full of so many women?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that has always intrigued me too about Patrick Kelly, the fashion designers. I think it was similar for him, is that, my aunts and my mom, like they were just fly. I mean, it's like, and I think that like when you look at a picture, and for me, I know like what work was like for them. I know the points in their life where they were struggling financially and not. And it still made no difference in terms of how they were trying to, represent themselves and
show up
their life, and show up in the world, right? Like, because that thing was, we're talking about clothes and things like that. So there's a material sort of thing. I think they also understood, and what I'm really speaking about is the thing that comes from the inside out, right? That's always going to be there. That's always available to them. And when I look at a picture, I'm seeing my mom in a wrap dress, but I'm also seeing how my mom animates that wrap dress. It's nothing without whatever she has. It's from the inside.
It sounds in a way that you feel responsible for letting them be more fleshed out rather than simply a photograph. You actually have some experience behind what the image is. You're actually able to tell a story about your parent, about your mom and her sisters, and you can tell it doesn't simply allow itself to be an image. It has more dimension and it's deep. You dive in deep, and you're a witness as you grew up, to what those women were doing and living and laughing and in pain or whatever. So it feels like you've been endowed with the position of a storyteller.
Yeah, and they modeled that. I think that that's what I wouldn't know what it would mean to be the person who now has the photographs, right? And who now can tell the story, be one of the people, because I don't have all of them, but who can tell the story if they didn't tell us how to do that. That was a part of our ritual. That was not a part of my ritual growing up. I would just be a person who was at this moment now missing all of those women, who raised me, and having this, archive of photos and not know what to do with them, So as in every other area of my life, I was totally prepared.
Right.
Beautiful.
And did Eric, did your family ever heal from the losses of the houses, the fires? Was there ever a point where your family sort of, that anxiety and fear around the fires and the loss, did that ever go away, or has that still does it still show up in even generations who didn't experience the fire?
I think both. I think the ways in which they were able to heal was because even though their home was destroyed, we still had family on that street. Yeah. So 40th Row never ceased being home, right? Mm-hmm. Even now, because Mr. Conrad's still there, but even if he weren't there, like there's just a way in which both in those photos and in those memories that are now passed on to me, and I'm now charged with my nieces and nephews to do the same. Like it's always our block, right? Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, like certain practices, right? No one in my family gets real Christmas trees. Period. I don't get right. And I remember the one year I did do it, a couple years I did it, felt like so nervous about it. Mm-hmm. And so when but I noticed now, I thought about this like just the most when I got the photos, when my mom, I ended up with the photos that my mom had, is when I went back to an artificial Christmas tree. So like, I think that like, that's a part of like the trauma, right? That's still in. Yeah. Like can you risk that? Are you going to risk this thing for of our families, right? So that you can have this tree. I think the other part of it too is I think they didn't get over, the trauma of just the fire itself, of losing all the other things, right? Because I just don't think they would have talked about it with as much regularity as they did if they had been totally healed of it.
Yeah.
Right. And no one in my family, I think, ever owned another house for decades after that. We always rented. And so I think that sense of pride, right, of this house that that was owned in our family, like being gone, I think did play a role in their a kind of refusal or decisions that they made to not own homes again too.
Yeah. I'm always curious about how these things sort of show up and just keep going, generation to generation. Still, that is passed down through the family. And so it's really interesting when these big things happen in our families, how no matter what, we still own it at some point. And it's really hard to let it go.
Yeah. And I've also thought of this too in terms of, my own, I'm not a homeowner either, right? Like, so, I feel like for me, I've been thinking about this more as I'm aging too. It's like, what is my responsibility to also try to work to heal certain aspects of this that is still traumatic for the family, right? One of my friends, Alexis, like, her dad said to her once, when you heal something for yourself, you heal it for all of us. Mm-hmm. And so I really thought about that in terms of like, if there is a fear around owning a home, maybe it's time for me to kind of buy some land, right? Kind of, work through that for myself, but also with my nieces and nephews, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that we can tell that story because it did happen and it affected the family the way it did, but we can still tell other stories, right?
Right.
There are always other stories.
Right.
There are always other stories.
Yeah.
Right.
That's just, thank you so very, very much, Dr. Pritchard. It has been awesome talking to you about this particular family story. And on behalf of me and Miranda, we just want to thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. This was healing, I think. Yeah, processing. Yeah, I'll be thinking.
We appreciate you, man. And yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you very much.